The wind came down from the high country like a long, slow breath smelling of pine pitch and old snow. And May Ellison stepped off the afternoon stage with a suitcase that had seen better years and a stitched seam at her collar that had been mended so many times it felt more thread than cloth. The platform boards creaked under her boots. The station was a lean shape of sun-faded paint and bent nails with a pot of coffee going stale inside and a fly that refused to quit its circling. The place was called Split Willow, a thumbprint of a town crouched between low hills and a river that liked to wander in spring. May was not young and not old. She was small the way a sparrow is small, as if the world might miss her if it did not look twice. She kept her chin level anyway. She had come farther than the polite gossip of back east thought she could. Farther than the mean winter that took her father, than the landlord who sold her sewing table out from under her, than the boarding house where the landlady said little women ought to be quiet and grateful. She had not come this far to be less than she was. No one waited with a bouquet. No one called her name. A pair of boys chased a dog along the edge of the street, and a blacksmith hit hot iron in a rhythm like a watch with a stubborn tick. Across the road, the saloon door swung and gave back laughter that had no patience for strangers. May set her suitcase down near the station bench and breathed. The air here did not smell like coal and cabbage. It smelled clean, which frightened her more than it should have. A man on the platform tipped his hat without smiling. Another looked measured, decided she was no trouble, and went on with his day. The station agent, a woman with strong shoulders and a kerchief tied tight over graying hair, came to the window. "You the dressmaker from out east?" the agent asked, voice dry as fence wire. "I can be," May said. "Depends who is asking." The agent jerked a thumb toward the hills. "Lot of torn cuffs out here. Torn lives, too. You staying or passing through?" "Staying if staying will have me." The agent held her a second longer in that narrow look women give each other when deciding which sorrows are worth the cost of words. "Room above the freight office if you have coin by weekend. Stove smokes, but it does not quit. That is more than some men I have known." The hint of a smile flickered and was gone. "Name is Ruth. If you need a kettle or a hammer, I lend both." May nodded her thanks. She had $4 and some change, 1 bar of lye soap, 2 needles fine enough for silk that she could not afford, a small tin of pins, a worn cutting wheel that had belonged to her mother, a recipe for biscuits in her head, and a memory of lavender in summer that surprised her sometimes, like a kindness she had not asked for. She lifted the suitcase again and found it heavier than it had felt when she boarded. That was when she saw him. Not at first for his size, though he had plenty of that, but for the way he took up space without taking it away from anyone else. He stood in the shade of the freight shed, hat brim low, shirt dark with work a length of timber bounced on one shoulder, as if it were no more trouble than a shawl. He was quiet the way trees are quiet, the kind of quiet that notices. When his eyes met hers, she felt seen in a way that did not steal anything. "You need a hand with that?" he asked, voice low. Not a boom, more like a creak under snow. "I have managed heavier," she said, "because pride will out even when it should not." Then she added, "If you would carry the other end, I would not be offended." He shifted the timber, set it down, and with careful hands took the suitcase as if it might bruise. "Name is Isaac Rourke," he said. "Most folks call me Ike, though I do not mind Isaac when it is meant kindly." "May Ellison," she said. "I do not mind May. Miss Ellison makes me feel like I am wearing a dress that is not mine." He nodded. "There is a bunkhouse on my place not far from town. Roof holds, stove draws. If you are between doors, it is a door." She looked at him full then. "Kindness is a fine word, but the world tends to ask a price for it. What would you take in return?" He set the suitcase down and seemed to try on a few answers before picking one that fit. "Supper sometimes if you felt like cooking. Needlework if a seam gives. I do not offer charity, I do not take advantage. The land is work enough for both." She studied the boots, the hands, the lines at the corners of his eyes that came from squinting at horizon and not from smiling at tavern girls. "What if I am trouble?" she asked. "Then I built a door for the wrong wind," he said. "But I doubt it." Ruth the agent watched them with a look like she could nail the sky down if it came loose. "I vouch he is decent," Ruth said. "He buys his sugar and remembers other mouths. Last winter he split wood for widows and did not put his name to it." Isaac lifted the suitcase again without waiting on pride to protest. I have a mule that is steadier than most men, he said. Come on if you will, stay if you will not. The offer holds either way. The road out of Split Willow ran thin between sage and grass that had been grass before her grandmother was born. The sun fell slow toward a line of hills that looked chewed by something too big to swallow. Isaac walked with a wide, easy stride that he shortened for her without making a point of it. The mule walked as if it had been told life was a job you could keep if you showed up each morning. They did not speak much. Talk is a coat folks put on when they are cold, and May, for the first time in months, was warm enough to go without. She kept her eyes on the light. She counted fence posts. She guessed at the weight of sky and found her guess too small. When the path bent around a stand of cottonwoods, the land opened, and there was a clearing with a small barn, a corral, a cabin set square to the wind, and a narrow structure tucked under a cottonwood. Like a second thought that turned out better than the first. Smoke curled from a stovepipe. A saw leaned against a stump, teeth still bright. I cut from the north slope, Isaac said, like a man explaining a thing, because explaining it keeps it true. It dries cleaner. Does not twist in the nail. May ran her fingers along the notch of a beam at the cabin corner. The joint sat tight. The chisel work was sure. Do you build for a living? She asked. I build because things fall apart if you leave them alone, he said. It is a habit I took up and have not yet broken. He showed her the bunkhouse. One room, swept. A cot with a wool blanket that had known hard winters. A small window that faced a line of pines and let the evening in like a guest that kept good manners. On the table sat a tin cup, a matched tin, a folded note in a careful hand. She glanced at Isaac. From Ruth, he said. She writes like a school teacher and curses like a farrier. The note will say welcome in a way that could cut bread. May smiled despite herself and unfolded the paper. Welcome, it said. The stove sticks if you slam it. The pump needs a firm hand, but not a mean one. There is a kettle in the cupboard and a pan under the cot. Do not be small in here. It is yours till it is not. Air. The knot in May loosened to turn. Not all the way, not yet, but enough. Isaac set her suitcase down by the cot and stepped back as if leaving a church. I will bring water, he said. There is coffee if you take it. If not, there is tea. The chickens lay as they please. I find eggs where I can and say thank you whether they hear me or not. She touched the sill of the window, felt the cool of evening in the wood. I can make stew, she said. I have made it out of less and fooled men into thinking it was plenty. He tipped his hat like a promise. Then we will have stew. I will be at the barn. If you hear the mule complain, he is lying. He complains from habit. When he was gone, the room went quiet in the kind way. May unpacked the small things that make a place less empty. Scissors with bone handles. A tomato pincushion gone pale with years. A spool of red thread that made her think of a door ribbon in summer. She set the lye soap near the basin and thought of her mother. She pressed her thumbs into the knots of her shoulders until her breath remembered how to be steady. Night came down gentle. A coyote called from the ridge like a song that forgot the tune, but kept the feeling. Isaac returned with a bucket on his hip and a loaf that looked like it had tried to be bread and nearly made it. He stood at the threshold until she waved him in, then handed over the bucket with both hands as if the water were a thing he could not afford to spill. She cut onions and he peeled potatoes. He was quiet with his work and did not correct her grip on the knife or tell a woman how to salt a pot. He only said when it boils slow, it is kinder to the meat. Kindness is a long cook. She thought that might be the first true sentence she had heard in a year. They ate at the small table without talking much, which is another way to say they talked plenty. Stoves have opinions, Isaac said at last. Doors do too. I have learned how to listen. The land tells you what it needs if you let it. Sometimes it asks for more than you can carry, and then it is a relief to find a person who can shoulder the other end without asking what it weighs. May set down her spoon. What is it you are building now, she asked. You said you cut from the north slope. You said you do not break the habit. He looked toward the dark beyond the window where the pines stood like old men keeping watch. A cabin, he said after a while. Not mine. Not yet. I have been cutting and squaring and setting aside. Walls are easier than people, but walls can hold people if you build them honest. She felt something shift inside her. Not a leap, a slow turning toward. And if the person is small, she asked, voice steady, if the world has a way of not seeing her unless she waves her hands and shouts, and even then, only sometimes, then the cabin has windows wide enough for the sun to find her, Isaac said. Then the floor is level so her steps are not unsure. Then the table is set low enough for her elbows to rest without hanging in air. Then the bed is a place that keeps its promises. She did not cry. She had cried herself empty 6 towns ago. But she felt the old ache loosen another turn. After the bowls were clean and the lamp turned down, Isaac stood in the doorway. The stars are good on clear nights, he said. There is a grove past the corral. If you listen, the cottonwoods tell stories the wind carried here when it was tired of going farther. I will listen tomorrow, I said. Tonight I am only as strong as the bed is soft. Soft is a word I will add to my list, he said, and then he was gone. The door pulled shut with that small, careful sound she would come to know. Alone, she slid under the wool and stared at the dark until it was not a fist. Sleep came slow and honest. Outside, something moved in the grass, but nothing came to the door. The stove ticked as it cooled. The mule complained and then forgot why. In the morning, she would wake to a sky too big a day, too wide a future that did not yet know her name. For now there was a room, a roof, a stranger who did not ask her to be smaller than she was, and the idea of a cabin that might one day hold a life she had not yet been allowed to imagine. The morning came with a soft gold light filtering through the thin curtain, the kind of light that did not belong to a city, but to a country that still believed in wide-open silence. May rose stiff from the cot, her hands numb from the long miles behind her. The basin water was cold, so cold it made her gasp. But the shock woke something in her she had nearly forgotten resolve. She dressed in her plain dress, patched but clean, and tied her hair with the last ribbons she owned. When she opened the door, the world was already awake. Isaac was in the yard sleeves, rolled swinging an axe in a rhythm that seemed older than language. Each strike bit clean into the pine log, splitting it sure and straight. The mule watched with bored patience, flicking flies with its tail. Smoke curled thin from the chimney of the cabin where he must have banked the fire before dawn. May stood a moment on the threshold, letting herself believe this was not a dream stitched together by fatigue. He noticed her then, not with surprise, but with the quiet nod of a man who expected her presence. "Morning," he said. "Morning," she answered, hugging her shawl tighter against the bite of the air. "Coffee on the stove," he added. "Help yourself." The bunkhouse smelled faintly of cedar and bread when she stepped back in for the tin pot. The coffee was strong enough to stand a spoon, bitter but honest. She poured a cup and carried it outside, watching Isaac's movements. He split 3 logs, stacked them neat, then set the axe aside as if tools deserved respect too. "Got fences needing mending," he said. "Mule knows the path, but I figure you've had enough traveling." "I can mend," May said softer than she meant. "I've mended my whole life." He studied her then, not long, just enough. "Fences are easier than people," he murmured. "But people mend too if they want." Her breath caught, but she said nothing. Instead, she set her cup down and crossed to the woodpile gathering kindling. He did not stop her. The hours stretched in a quiet rhythm. Isaac fixed a loose rail on the corral while May swept the bunkhouse stoop, her skirts catching dust that swirled in the sun. The mule brayed once in complaint, but when Isaac chuckled, May found herself smiling too, though it felt strange on her lips. By noon, the air grew warmer. Isaac returned from the barn with a saddlebag torn at the seam. "Thought you might like to try your hand," he said, laying it on the stoop beside her. May touched the worn leather with reverence. She fetched her bone-handled scissors and the red thread she had carried across the states and seas. The leather was thick, stubborn under the needle, but her fingers remembered patience. Isaac sat on the rail watching without intruding. "You've got steady hands," he said finally. "Steady hands make steady work," she replied. "It's the rest of me that's uncertain." He tilted his head as if weighing her words. "The world is uncertain, May. Not you." She looked up startled, but his gaze was already turned toward the ridge, as if the hills carried secrets he would rather measure than her face. They ate beans and cornbread for supper. Isaac bowed his head briefly before he ate, not with words but with silence, a habit of men who kept their faith in quiet places. May mirrored him, though her prayers had long gone unanswered. The food was plain, but it was warm, and when she caught herself licking the last bit of molasses from her thumb, she did not feel shame. After the meal, he brought out a lantern and motioned her toward the cottonwoods. The grove was alive with the whisper of leaves. The wind moved like water, carrying echoes of things long gone. Isaac stood with one hand on a trunk, listening as if the trees spoke plain. "You hear it?" he asked. "Only the wind," she said. "That's enough," he answered. "Wind's been carrying stories longer than we've been listening." They stood side by side as the stars broke open above them. She felt the weight of her past loosen just a little, as if the land itself had taken a corner of it. When they walked back, he handed her a small folded cloth. Inside was a square of muslin, faded but clean with a single neat stitch at the edge. "Started it last winter," he said. "Not much good with a needle. Figured you might finish it." May ran her fingers over the uneven lines. "You build walls and you sew cloth. Seems you want everything to hold." "I want nothing to fall apart," he said simply. She looked at him, then at the breadth of his shoulders, the scar that curved along his jaw, the steadiness in his eyes. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, May felt not small, not forgotten, but necessary. That night she returned to the bunkhouse holding the cloth like a promise. She set it beside her pincushion and whispered into the dark. Not a prayer exactly, but something close. "Please," she said, "let this hold." The next morning broke with a pale sky streaked in pink, the kind of dawn that hinted at storms, yet kept its silence for now. May woke early, her hands stiff from sewing late into the night. The muslin square lay folded on the little table, its edges neat now, her stitches holding firm where Isaac's had faltered. She touched it once before, rising, slipping her shawl across her shoulders and stepping outside. The air was sharp with pine resin and dew. Isaac was already in the yard as she had expected, rolling a wheel of hay toward the corral, with the kind of steady patience that seemed to define him. The mule brayed once, eager for feed, and Isaac chuckled low, a sound almost lost beneath the rustle of the cottonwoods. "Morning," he said, not looking up. "Morning," she answered, her voice stronger than yesterday. He tipped the hay into the trough, dust puffing into the golden light, then turned toward her. "You sew that cloth." "I did," she said. "It will hold now." He nodded once, as if this was no small thing. "Then so will you." Her breath caught at the words, but he had already turned back to his work. After breakfast, corn cakes and bitter coffee, they walked to the edge of the property where the fence sagged against a fallen post. Isaac lifted it as if it weighed nothing, muscles straining beneath his rolled sleeves while May steadied the rail. "Hand me a nail," he said. She did, their fingers brushing briefly. The touch was simple work born, but it carried something that lingered. By midday, the sun burned hot, and Isaac motioned toward the shade of the cottonwoods. They sat on a fallen log, passing a tin cup of water between them. "You're not afraid of labor," he said. "I've labored my whole life," May replied. "What I fear is being discarded when the work is done." Isaac's eyes pale as morning sky turned toward her. "I don't discard what holds." The silence that followed was not empty. It wrapped around her like a blanket, unfamiliar but welcome. Later that afternoon, May returned to the bunkhouse to mend another saddlebag. Her red thread flashed against the leather, bright as blood in the dim light. Outside, she heard Isaac's axe splitting wood, each strike like a heartbeat, steady and true. When he came in at dusk carrying a bundle of kindling, he paused at the sight of her sewing. "You mend like you mean it," he said. "Mending is all I know," she answered. "Then maybe it's all we both know," he said, setting the wood by the stove. They ate stew that night, thick with beans and wild onion. Isaac bowed his head again, and May followed, though this time her whisper carried weight. Not a prayer for survival, but for belonging. After supper, he brought out a lantern and led her toward the half-built cabin frame he had started near the cottonwoods. The posts stood tall, squared, and true, though the walls were only half raised. "I began it last spring," he said. "Thought I'd finish when the time felt right." And now she asked, her hand resting on one of the rough beams. "Now feels closer," he said, though he did not look at her. She ran her fingers along the grain of the wood, feeling the strength there, the promise of shelter. "Will you let me help?" "If you wish," he said. So she did. The next days unfolded in rhythm, hauling boards, steadying beams, handing him nails while he drove them clean. Her arms ached, her back burned, but the ache felt honest, a different kind of inheritance than the shame she had carried. At night, she returned to the bunkhouse, too tired to think, yet unable to stop the quiet hope building inside her. Isaac worked beside her, steady as stone, his silence not empty, but full of respect. One evening, as they stood back to look at the rising frame, The sun dipped low, setting the sky aflame. May brushed a strand of hair from her face, sweat streaking her brow. Isaac handed her a cup of water, their fingers brushing again. She met his gaze this time, and neither looked away. "You build like you live," she said softly. "Slow, sure, and meant to last." "And you mend like you live," he replied. "Careful, stubborn, unwilling to let go." The words settled between them like nails set true into wood. That night, May lay awake long after the lantern burned out. The storm Isaac had warned of still hadn't come, but she felt one gathering inside her, not of fear, but of change. She touched the muslin square again, the stitches holding fast, and whispered to the dark, "Please let me hold too." The storm came on a Thursday evening, rolling down from the mountains like a black tide. All day the sky had worn a strange copper color. The air, too, still the birds too quiet. May had felt it building in her bones, the way old women claimed they could feel weather in their knees. By dusk, thunder was already muttering low, a warning growl that made the mule shift nervously in its pen. Isaac worked harder as the light faded, hauling the last of the boards into the cabin frame, his jaw set. May followed with rope and tools, refusing to be sent inside, though the wind whipped her skirts around her legs. "You should take cover," he called over the rising howl. "Not without you," she answered. His eyes flicked to hers, then back to the work, as if her words had nailed him steadier than any beam. When the first fat drops of rain struck the dirt, Isaac led her quickly toward the main house. The sky cracked open, lightning spilling white fire across the valley, and the storm arrived in full fury. Rain lashed sideways, rattling the shutters, turning the yard into rivers of mud. May stood at the window, heart hammering. "The bunkhouse," she said, suddenly remembering her few belongings, the scissors, the locket, the cloth she had stitched. "It will flood." Isaac was already pulling on his coat. "I'll fetch them." "No," she cried, "I can do it." "You won't," he said firmly, catching her arm. "I will. Stay here." But she shook her head, trembling. "I've lost too much already. I can't sit idle and watch the rest drown." His eyes locked on hers, fierce and unyielding. "Then we go together." They plunged into the storm, the rain cutting like knives against their skin. The ground sucked at their boots, but they pushed forward, heads bent. The bunkhouse door banged wildly in the wind when they reached it. Inside, water was already pooling across the floor. May rushed to the cot, grabbing her suitcase and sewing kit, clutching them tight. Isaac shoved the stove aside and lifted the wooden trunk, water pouring from its seams. "Hurry," he shouted, his voice nearly drowned by thunder. They staggered back to the main house, soaked to the bone. Isaac dumped the trunk by the hearth while May clung to her case like it was life itself. Her hands shook as she opened it, checking the scissors, the red thread, the cloth. All safe, all dry. She sank onto the floor, tears mixing with rain on her cheeks. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I shouldn't have dragged you into that." Isaac crouched before her, water streaming from his hair. He took her trembling hands in his. "May, nothing you carry is a burden. Nothing." The storm raged for hours. Wind battered the walls and rain hammered the roof until it seemed the sky itself might fall. Isaac kept the fire alive, feeding it, carefully shielding it from drafts. May sat near him, her shawl steaming as it dried her suitcase beside her, like a loyal hound. Sometime past midnight, the storm eased its fury, retreating into distant grumbles. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the crackle of the fire. May looked at Isaac, his face lined by shadows and lamplight. "Thank you," she said simply. He shook his head. "Don't thank me. Storms pass. But what you held on to, that's what lasts." Her throat tightened. "I've spent so many years thinking nothing I held mattered. And yet you fought for it tonight," he said. "That matters more than all the years behind." The firelight caught the scar along his jaw, the tired set of his shoulders, the steady strength in his eyes. Without thinking, May reached out, laying her hand over his. Rough against rough, scar against scar. His fingers closed gently around hers, not demanding, not presuming, but certain. Outside, the rain slowed to a whisper. Inside, something heavier than the storm shifted between them, fragile and fierce all at once. When dawn came, the world outside was transformed. The yard was a sea of mud, branches littered the ground, and the half-built cabin sagged where the storm had torn at it. May stood on the porch, shawl wrapped tight, staring at the damage. Her heart clenched at the sight of broken beams of work undone. Isaac stepped beside her. "Storms test what's weak," he said quietly. But what holds after, that's the truth of it. She looked up at him, and for the first time in years, May believed that maybe she was strong enough to hold too. The storm left the valley raw and broken. For 2 days, the air smelled of wet earth and splintered pine. May woke each morning to the sound of Isaac hauling debris, his boots sinking deep into the mud, his muscles straining as he cleared fallen branches from the yard. She joined him, skirts tied up to her knees, hands blistered from carrying wood and stacking stones. On the third morning, the sun rose clear and bright, burning the last of the storm mist away. The cabin frame stood battered but not ruined, its beams leaning like wounded soldiers. Isaac walked around it in silence, touching each post, each board. May watched him, her stomach tight with dread. "Is it lost?" she asked finally. He shook his head. "Not lost, just tested." She exhaled slowly, the word tested, settling deep inside her. Together they began again. Isaac reset the foundation stones, his shoulders bent to the weight of them. May steadied planks, hammered nails, and hauled water to mix with clay for patching gaps. Her arms trembled, her back screamed, but she did not stop. Each strike of the hammer felt like stitching another piece of herself into place. At midday, they rested under the cottonwoods, sharing bread and dried apples. Isaac studied her hands, red and raw. "You're bleeding," he said. She shrugged. "Skin heals." His eyes softened. "Not all wounds do." She looked down at her palms, at the blisters rising like angry pearls. "Maybe not," she admitted. "But some are worth the ache." He said nothing but the way he handed her the water skin. Gentle, careful, told her he understood. As the days passed, the cabin grew stronger. New beams rose, truer than before. Isaac showed her how to brace the walls, how to drive nails without splitting the wood. He taught her to measure by eye, to trust the line of her arm and the weight of her hand. She listened, learned, and surprised herself by remembering. One evening, after they set the last of the rafters, they sat on the porch steps of the main house, sweat cooling on their skin. The half-built cabin stood golden in the sunset, its shape clear now, its promise undeniable. "You build steady," she said softly. "I build to last," he answered. She hesitated, then asked, "And what if storms come again?" "They will," he said without pause. "But we'll be ready." She repeated the word, tasting strange but sweet. He glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "Unless you plan to leave?" She looked out at the cabin, the corral, the cottonwoods whispering in the dusk. "I've been running all my life," May said. "I think I'm done." Isaac's jaw tightened, not with doubt, but with something like relief. "Then we'll finish it together." That night back in the bunkhouse, May lay awake staring at the muslin square on the table. Her stitches held firm bright against the faded cloth. "Tested, not lost," she whispered. The words felt like a vow. The next morning, she carried her sewing kit to the cabin. Isaac was already there, setting a window frame. She spread the muslin across the sill, smoothing it flat. When he looked at her questioningly, she said, "It's not glass, but it will hold the light." His gaze lingered on her longer than the cloth. "It's enough," he said quietly. For the first time, May felt not just useful, not just tolerated, but wanted. Not for her work, not for her endurance, but for herself. The cabin rose higher with each day, and with it something inside May rose too, a fragile, stubborn hope that maybe storms did not only destroy. Maybe they cleared the air for something stronger to be built. Autumn crept into the valley with a sharpness that made the mornings bite at May's fingers. Frost laced the grass, and the sky turned the color of hammered steel. The cabin stood almost complete now, roof tight, walls strong. The porch wide enough for 2 chairs. Inside, the scent of pine resin still clung to the beams. It should have been a season of peace, of steady work and quiet evenings. But peace was never promised in the Wild West. The first sign came with hoofbeats at dusk. May was stacking kindling when she heard them, 3 horses pounding down the ridge. Isaac stepped out of the barn, his face darkening as the riders appeared. Strangers. Broad hats pulled low rifles, slung careless across their saddles. Their leader dismounted with a smile that never reached his eyes. "Heard you're building on this land," he drawled. "Problem is, Blacktail Ranch claims this stretch. Always has." Isaac's voice was steady. "I filed papers. It's mine." The man spat into the dirt. Papers don't mean much when fire sweeps through or cattle wander. May's stomach twisted. She gripped the hem of her shawl, forcing herself not to shrink back. The man's gaze slid to her, lingering too long. "New wife?" he asked mockingly. Isaac's jaw tightened, but he didn't answer. "We'll be back in a week," the man said. "Best have your things packed." When they rode off, the dust hung heavy in the air. Isaac cursed under his breath. May stepped closer, heart thundering. Will they really come back? He looked at her, then eyes hard. They always do. The next days were filled with unease. Isaac worked longer hours fortifying fences, sharpening tools. May patched old blankets into makeshift sacks, though the thought of fleeing made her sick. Each night she stitched by lamplight, her needle moving fast as if each thread could bind their fragile safety tighter. On the fourth night, she set her sewing aside and said, "I won't run again. If they come, we stand." Isaac studied her across the firelight, silent for so long she thought he might refuse her words. Then he said, "Storms test what's weak. If you're certain, then we build to last." When the week ended, the riders did return. Dust rose on the horizon and May's throat went dry. Isaac handed her a rifle. "Can you shoot?" "Not well," she admitted. His hand brushed hers, steadying. "Breathe out slow. Don't yank." They stood side by side as the men approached, three shadows against the setting sun. The leader smirked. "Didn't take our warning serious, did you?" Isaac raised his rifle. "This land's mine. This cabin's ours." "Ours," Mintam echoed, her voice clear, despite the fear clawing her chest. The standoff stretched long, the air heavy with the threat of violence. Then slowly the leader's smirk faltered. He spat again, turned his horse and rode off without a shot fired. The others followed, muttering. May's knees nearly gave out with relief. Isaac lowered his rifle but didn't look away until the dust had vanished. Only then did he turn to her. "You stood," he said. "So did you," she whispered. The cabin loomed behind them, strong, unyielding. For the first time, May believed it truly was theirs, not because of paper, not because of law, but because they had chosen to claim it together. That night, as the fire burned low and the wind carried the last of the riders' dust away, May rested her head on Isaac's shoulder. Storms had tested them, and still they stood. Winter came early that year, sweeping across the valley with winds that rattled the shutters and carved frost onto every window pane. Yet inside the new cabin, warmth lived in every corner. The hearth glowed steady, filling the room with the smell of wood smoke and bread. May sat at the table, needle in hand, stitching the last square of a quilt she had pieced from scraps of old dresses, flour sacks, and strips of muslin. Each patch told a story of survival of storms, weathered of days when leaving had seemed easier than staying. Isaac entered from the cold snow, clinging to his coat, his breath rising in white clouds. He carried a bundle of logs in his arms, dropping them near the hearth. When he looked at her, something softened in his eyes. Something that had been there for weeks now but spoke louder each day. "It's done," he said simply. "The cabin." She set her needle aside, heart catching. She followed him to the doorway where he pushed open the wooden door to the new room he had been finishing in secret. Sunlight slanted through a window he had framed himself, catching on a cradle he had carved from juniper wood. A cradle, she whispered, her hands trembling as she touched the smooth edge. His voice was quiet, almost hesitant. "You said once you thought you were too small to be chosen, but I built this cabin for you, May. Not because I had to, not because you asked, but because I want you here." Tears blurred her vision. For so long she had been cast aside, too soft, too quiet, too broken. Yet here stood a man who had built something lasting, not in spite of her, but because of her. She turned to him. "Why me?" He met her gaze without flinching. "Because you stayed. Because you fought when you could have run. Because you make this place more than wood and nails. You make it home." Her throat ached with unshed tears. Slowly she placed her hand against his chest, feeling the steady beat beneath. "I was left behind my whole life, Isaac. But if you'll have me, I'll never leave again." His arms came around her strong and sure, pulling her close. "No more running," he murmured into her hair. "Not for either of us." Outside, snow drifted across the yard, softening the harsh lines of the world. Inside, the fire snapped and crackled, and the quilt in May's lap grew heavier with meaning. They stood together in the glow of the hearth, not as two souls surviving, but as two who had chosen to build. In the silence, May whispered, "It's not just a cabin, Isaac. It's us." And in his steady embrace, she knew she had finally found what every storm, every loss, every lonely mile had been leading her toward. Not perfection, not promises of forever untouched by hardship, but the simple, defiant truth of belonging. Upon home.